Pre-Romanticism. The age of Classicism is followed by a transitional period known as the Pre-Romantic Age, which comes from 1740 and lasts till 1780. In fact, in this period we can observe a new sensibility in poetry and a new generation of poets arising. Thus, it is also called the Age of Sensibility. These poets use subjective, autobiographical materials which marked a new trend towards the expression of a lyrical and personal experience of life. They were less intellectual and more emotional, presenting a variety of emotional states of the soul. The transitional poetry marks the beginning of a reaction against the rational, intellectual, formal, and artificial, unromantic poetry of the age of Pope and Johnson. It was marked by a strong reaction against stereotype rules. The transitional poets revolted against the conventional poetic style and diction of the Augustan poetry. They aimed at achieving simplicity of expression. The transitional poets derived their inspiration from Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. Unlike the Augustan poetry, it is a poetry of countryside, of common and ordinary people, and not of the fashionable aristocratic society and town life. So the main themes of the pre-romantic literature would then be a love for nature and return to nature, expressed through an interest in the picturesque, the wild, the grandiose, the lonely, the desolate, and the love for the sublime. B. This poetry appealed to emotions and imagination, and believed that imagination should not be subordinated to the intellect. C. It's heavily melancholic. It is expressed by the love of ruins, the idealization of solitude, meditations on man's unhappy destiny. D. They exalt primitive life of a different civilization, and long for a last earthly paradise in which man lived in communion with nature. A typical expression of this is the myth of the noble savage. E. An interest in the Middle Ages, which is considered a mysterious and barbarous period. F. An interest in Gothic architecture as a typical expression of the medieval spirit. The major poets of this period would be James Thomson, Thomas Gray, William Cowper, William Collins, George Crabbe, and Robert Burns. Some important thinkers of Romanticism are Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant. Let's first talk about Edmund Burke. Although primarily known as a political thinker, Burke's aesthetic theory, in a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, published in 1757, had a significant impact on Romantic philosophy. He distinguished between the beautiful, the pleasing and orderly, and the sublime, the awe-inspiring, vast and terrifying. This theory laid the foundation for Romantic explorations of the power of nature, the supernatural, and emotional extremes. His work helped shape the Romantic fascination with mystery, transcendence, and the darker aspects of human experience. Immanuel Kant. Though he was an Enlightenment philosopher, his later works introduced ideas that deeply influenced Romanticism. In his critique of judgment, he explored aesthetic experience, arguing that beauty and the sublime are subjective experiences shaped by human perception. His concept of the sublime, particularly its relation to nature and human imagination, became central to Romantic aesthetics. Now, Pre-Romanticism is an umbrella movement under which three different movements were going on. First, the Graveyard School of Poetry. Second, the Gothic novel. And third, the Sturm und Drang, which is the storm and stress movement. Graveyard School was a mid-18th century poetic movement in Britain that focused on themes of death, decay, and passage of time. Features of Graveyard School would be 1. It is often set in graveyards or ruins, anticipating the darker themes of Romanticism. 2. The poets reflect on human mortality, the inevitability of death, and the equality of all in death. 3. The poetry is melancholic, the poet is in solitude. 4. They focus on passage of time and the fleeting nature of life. 5. It explored awe-inspiring and eerie imagery, foreshadowing Gothic. Poets use meditative melancholic reflections on mortality, to evoke a sense of the sublime. This can be seen in works of Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard in 1751, Edward Young's Night Thoughts in 1742, and Robert Blair's The Grave in 1743. Their focus on mystery, solitude, and human finitude influenced the Gothic literary tradition. Which brings me to our next movement, the Gothic novel. The Gothic novel, emerging in the late 18th century, blended horror, supernatural elements, and medieval aesthetics to create a heightened sense of fear and mystery. The features of the 18th century Gothic fiction are 1. A brooding, mysterious hero, 2. A haunted mansion with dark secrets, 3. Supernatural elements like an eerie laughter or ghostly visions, 4. Themes of isolation, madness, and human psychology, 5. The grotesque. The grotesque is something that is bizarre, often creating a sense of unease by mixing beautiful and monstrous, comic and terrifying. In Gothic literature, the grotesque appears in deformed, nightmarish, or exaggerated characters, for example, Frankenstein's creature or Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The first major Gothic novel was Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, written in 1764. After that, multiple Gothic novels made their entry into the mainstream, like Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho in 1794, Matthew Lewis' The Monk in 1796, and later, the Gothic tradition extended into Romanticism, influencing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte in 1847, and Tales of Edgar Allan Poe. Finally, we move on to our last sub-movement under the pre-Romantic movements, the Sturm und Drang movement. Emerging in the late 18th century, nearly around the 1760s, Sturm und Drang was a German literary and philosophical movement that emphasized emotion, individualism, and rebellion against rationalism. Inspired by Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea on nature and sentiment, the key figure here was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whose novel The Sorrows of Young Werther, written in 1774, and Friedrich Schiller's The Robbers, 1781. The major features of this movement was that it focused on personal freedom and emotions and rejected societal norms and authority. Therefore, the heroes were rebellious, yet tragic. Nature was seen as a powerful force, and it took a majority of its influence from folk traditions. Rationalism and secular philosophy of the Enlightenment period that preceded Pre-Romanticism challenged traditional religious authority, promoting scientific inquiry and individual reason over faith. Plus, the corruption and rigid dogma in institutions like the Catholic Church led to growing skepticism and criticism of Christianity, especially in France before the Revolution. Many intellectuals, including Voltaire, embraced deism, which rejected organized religion but accepted a rational creator. Rousseau criticized institutional religion but still valued faith, spirituality, and nature as divine. Meanwhile, for thinkers like William Wordsworth and Ralph Waldo Emerson, divinity was found in nature rather than in churches. Goethe and Schelling embraced pantheism. Pantheism is a belief that God and the universe are identical, meaning that divinity exists in all things and nature itself is sacred. The graveyard poets wrote about death and the afterlife, reflecting religious and existential concerns. But during the pre-Romantic period, traditional religious authority declined, but spirituality, mysticism, and personal faith found new expressions in literature and philosophy. And during Romanticism, writers like Percy Bysshe Shelley, an outspoken atheist, and Lord Byron openly challenged Christian hypocrisy and dogma in their works. I will talk more about these Romantic writers like Wordsworth, Shelley, Byron, and many more in my lecture on Romanticism.